have any sort of formal introductions, or did I just get started?
Well, normally one of the graduate students is supposed to introduce you, but I don't know who Trish has set up to do that.
Anybody supposed to do that? Well, good. It's going to be a short introduction. It's 4:01, Dan, and my anal retentiveness is gnawing at me.
All right, have at it, Charlie.
All right, very good. Hey, thanks very much for coming. My name is Dr. Charlie Hall, and I know almost all of you, and indirectly or directly. I'm holder of the Ellison Chair in International Floriculture here. I am an economist, trained formally in agricultural economics, but I have one of my degrees is in horticulture, so I'm a true hybrid, Bill. It's always, hybrids are good. And that's right, that's right. And today I'm going to be talking about an outlook for the green industry, speaking primarily in terms of the economics that is facing the green industry. And by green industry, I'm talking about the entire supply chain complex from what we call allied trade. And allied trade is all the manufacturers and distributors, re-wholesalers and so forth, all through the supply chain, growers, landscape service providers, retailers, and then the end consumer. So that entire supply chain is referred to as the green industry. And it is a very complex industry, albeit the linkages are fairly simplistic, but there's a lot of interrelationships between the different sectors within the industry. And of course, there's multitudes of crops. And having served earlier in my career as the horticultural marketing economist, covering every single horticultural crop, it's been kind of nice to focus in on the green industry. But we have floral crops, Terry, and we have ornamental shrubs and trees, Mike. And so somehow we make it all come together. And then we have that yucky turf grass that we throw into the mix. I don't think there's anybody from soil and crop science here, but I say that almost jokingly, although what's my word here? I lost my word. It's an indication of some of the struggle we find in the green industry. There are certain parts of the country in which turf grass is not necessarily welcomed, i.e. California, particularly in the midst of drought. And so you have this dynamic within the landscape system that shrubs and trees are okay and turf grass is not okay. Or if you consider carbon footprint, then certainly trees are have a positive carbon footprint. But Terry, when you look at bedding plants and the short life within the landscape relative to a mature tree, it has somewhat negative carbon footprint. So it depends on the perspective in which you're viewing this and in terms of what is good or bad. And there's not really a formal definition. I think we are better suited to think in terms of landscape systems, and that there's a place for every component, and that as a landscape system, we are sustainable, we are we're not even carbon neutral, we're vastly carbon positive, and that we sequester a lot more carbon than what was generated in producing these flowers, shrubs, and trees. And of course, in today's environment in which we find ourselves, the end consumer, particularly millennial generation, Gen Z generation, a lot more environmentally conscious than previous generations, Gen X and boomers. And we will see in our country at some point, some type of carbon trading that will go on, Marco, within the United States. We're not there yet, but when that time comes, there will be companies that will be looking to mitigate their carbon footprint. And the best way they do that, plant flowers, shrubs, and trees, right? And particularly a lot of trees because of the vast positive carbon footprint that those have. Now, that has nothing to do with economics, but it's setting a stage in terms of this industry is facing a lot of critical issues. And we're always in a mode of contingency. We're always responding to some sort of external force outside the green industry marketplace. But if you look at the industry, as much of agriculture, there's very little government intervention, and that which does occur tends to be oppressive in nature in terms of regulatory. Now, I use that term purposefully as well, because on the one hand, business owners might view that as oppressive and to incur the cost of adhering to those regulations. However, as a society, unless we have those regulations, the profit maximization model always says the firm will operate in a low-cost profit maximization mode, and adhering to regulations is not necessarily part of that equation. Now, flip the switch and look at sustainability. If you consider sustainability as a strategy for cost reduction, then sustainable firms generally are more profitable than non-sustainable firms, or those firms that are acting outside of care for the environment, or acting outside of care for the clean air, clean water, et cetera. It's those firms that are acting in a sustainable manner that generally are the most profitable. That's the conundrum, and that's what's least known, not only within the green industry, but outside of the green industry as well. Now, this is all a precursor, right? This is just a precursor to me saying that there's a lot of things that are happening simultaneously in and outside the green industry that we have to react to. And of course, the 900-pound gorilla, if I go to the next slide here, of course, is Russia. Now, right away, I'm going to tackle this big red bear or whatever. Do we use a red bear for Russia? I don't know. But we're going to tackle this particular topic. It's top of mind. It's something that needs to be addressed. And then we'll fold in some other dimensions of what's happening in the green industry supply chain. So obviously, as you know, yes. Oh, yeah. Thanks. Yep. Boom. Thank you. If you consider, Russia for many years, for many decades, we were in a Cold War, quote unquote, with Russia, had the space race and so forth. Russia was our big enemy, and a lot of our political stature was in response to Russia. However, if you consider the size of the economies, Russia, Ukraine versus the US and Europe, you see there on the left-hand side, that's a really small economy. I think the Ukraine economy is 154 billion, right? Huh? Yeah, basically the size of New York City, right? Just within New York. I don't even think all of New York State, but it's a relatively small economy. Russia is 1.2, 1.3 trillion, whereas in the US, we're $23 trillion. And you've heard me say this before, we throw around millions, billions, and trillions like it's nothing. You hear it in the media and so forth. But to count to a billion, just to count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way to a billion, how long would it take you? 32 years, right? 32 years, just to count to a billion. Now, if you don't believe me, go ahead and try it, right? To count to a trillion would take you 36,000 years. And we're a 23 trillion plus dollar economy. I mean, we're a sizable force. 25% of the world's GDP is what we represent. Russia's less than 2%. Now, what's critical is that Russia produces some significant agricultural commodities and some raw materials that go into producing fertilizer. So right now, fertilizers, just for corn and bean farmers, hi Betsy, just corn and bean farmers, the fertilizers are like 800% over what they were just last year. Have gone up tremendously. And that means that some of the specialty fertilizers that we use in the green industry are going to be seeing, or they're already seeing, this inflationary pressure as well. All right, so that's one influence, direct influence, that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has had. Now, they also produce, like I said, a lot of agricultural commodities, wheat in particular, and then there's other sunflower oil and so forth that the Ukraine produces. So it's, if you roll up all of the agricultural commodities that the Ukraine and Russia produces, it's going to have an influence on our consumer price index. You know, we're already at a roughly 7% inflation at the close of 2021. But as you move into this new paradigm, it may impact us maybe by a percentage point in terms of our own consumer price index here in the U.S. So it's not going to rock the boat. Now, you saw oil prices escalate to $25 a barrel, and it was over $100 a barrel and so forth. And that $25 a barrel increase was fairly significant. We hadn't seen that in a while. But to put it in perspective, before many of you were born, back in the 70s, when we had the oil and gas embargoes and so forth, oil prices tripled, right? So we're not anywhere near that right now. So far, we've had a 30% increase in the price of oil. If this were to hold for the next 2 years, then likely we would see a hit on our GDP of about 0.3%. If this level of oil production or the oil prices were to hold through 2022 and 2023, right? So it's got a kind of a minimal impact. Now, at the same time, our equity markets, the stock market, has decreased by 12% since the first of the year. All right, we've taken a hit there. If we assume that it continues, and even if we have a 20% reduction in our equity markets through 2022, all the way through 2023, the most that it would mean would be still less than 1% reduction in GDP. All right, so those two decreases combined would still not be enough to throw us into recession. So right from the get-go, right, before we even get into the green industry, I'm just putting that to rest. Yes, it's going to have some volatility early on. Any geopolitical disturbance like this always ends up with volatility, both in the equity markets and or commodities, whatever that country produces, right? There's always volatility there. That will hurt in the short run. And yet the Federal Reserve still stands ready to raise interest rates. Now, I say that because the Federal Reserve has two missions. Well, number one, to create an environment where we can maximize employment, that those people who want to have a job have an opportunity to have a job. All right, so they set a stage for maximum employment. Number two, they mitigate the impact or the likelihood of inflationary pressures on the economy. That's their twofold mission. The way that they do that is through a mix of fiscal and monetary policy working hand in hand with the Treasury Department with various tools, primarily interest rates. And so Jay Powell, who's the director, the chairperson of the Federal Reserve right now, after their last meeting, he implied that the Federal Reserve is going to move rather aggressively. In my humble opinion, and you won't see this in the media, you won't see this written anywhere, this is only my opinion, I think we'll see a 25 basis point increase in March. I think we'll follow it up with another 25 basis points in April and in May. And then I think the Fed will wait during the summer see what kind of response that had, because, well, I'll get to that in a second. And then in September, they're likely to come back with another 25 basis points, and even December with 25 basis points. So if you add all that together, that's 1.25%. We're at 0.25% right now. That's going to get us all the way to a federal funds rate of 1.5%. That's still cheap money. So it's not going to impede corporations, green industry businesses, landscapers, garden centers. It's not going to be enough to impede business investment. But what it will do is it'll pull back a little bit on final demand. Now, what do I mean by final demand? Well, by final demand, I'm talking about what consumers consume. And when the interest rates go up, that means that the revolving credit goes up. They put less money on their credit card. They buy fewer durable goods. They buy fewer cars, airplanes. I have to say that because I had a grower visit me this week. He flew in to College Station in his airplane. So now I have to add airplanes to the mix of cars. So we buy fewer cars, we buy fewer airplanes, we buy less gas because everything is more expensive because to put things on credit. And we Americans, we're not bashful about putting things on credit. That's one of the reasons why the Great Recession was so difficult, and because people had to recalibrate their credit relative to what they pay cash. All right, so we have this scenario here. I even go back here. I got 50 slides, and I haven't gotten past the first one yet. So I'm going on the fly here. So the inflation that we see right here, right now, that we're experiencing, roughly 7% in the last year. The question is, what's causing that inflation? Well, right now, it's a very complex answer, but I'm going to answer it as simply as I can. When we look at inflation, Marco, we usually say, is it cost push? That is the cost of everything, all the inputs that it takes to make cars and airplanes and plants, trees, are all those inputs getting more expensive? Therefore, prices have to be more expensive to cover the added cost, right? So that's cost push inflation. The second type is wage push inflation. That if wages are going up, we're paying more to the people that are employed in our businesses. They have more spending money. Therefore, on the demand side, they have more money in which to spend. And so we spend as a country. We're really good at spending. 70% of that $23 trillion GDP I was talking about is in what you and I and everybody else spends. All right, 70% of GDP is wrapped up in consumption. All right, so we're really good at spending. So when people earn more, they spend more. There's a famous adage from a well-known economist that says expenditures rise to meet income. So it's magic. If you make more money, you're going to spend more money. You may save a little bit more, but by and large, we put more, our savings is the value of our homes and our IRAs and so forth. We don't we don't save like the kids that were a product of the Great Depression. Bill, in the 70s, people were spending or saving 13% of their income in the 70s. But now they save less than 4%, right? On average, right? So people are making more, they're spending more. That's wage push inflation. Now, the third type is demand pull, and it's related to the second one I talked about, that people, when they buy stuff and there's a lot of demand and there's a little bit of supply, prices go up, right? That's just the nature of supply and demand. When the demand is here and the supply is here, prices are going to go up. So when we encountered COVID and we passed the CARES Act, We were trying to put money in people's hands because the GDP is so wrapped up in consumption that had people not had the supplemental assistance by the government during that time period, and they were having to stay at home and not work, not have an income, expending what we spent would have gone down dramatically. That would have thrown us into recession, most probably. So we introduced the CARES Act, which every single Democrat and every single Republican voted for on both sides of the aisle, because it's pretty evident we got to keep the ship afloat, and the increase in the national debt that occurs, we'll handle that later. So Jay Powell and Janet Yellen, who's the chair of the Treasury, both of them agreed. This is what we've got to do. Everybody on each side of the political fence agreed. This is what we got to do. Although you'll hear a different story now. Now that the inflation is here, you see the finger pointing. But it always occurs. The party that's not in office is going to use anything to point to the party that is in office and say it's their fault, right? But now you know economically, this is what happens. We stimulated final demand so people could still spend more. Now, at the same time, when COVID hit, manufacturers said, whoa, Nelly, sky's falling, cancel my orders for inputs, let's pull back, lay people off, and let's ride this thing out. 2 months later, when we're deemed to be essential, and we found out, well, maybe we can mask and so forth. And so they see all the folks getting some money in their checking accounts through the CARES Act, the American Rescue Plan, the child tax credits, and then the $1,200 checks that were delivered straight to people's door directly. When they saw that people were still spending, whoa, we got to start manufacturing again, because if we don't, we're going to run out of stuff. And people need our stuff, obviously, because they're still buying our stuff. So that created this supply chain snafu. So now we've got the supply chain that put the brakes on, and then they're starting to try to regain that momentum, and you've got this backlog. You've got stuff that's in containers. You've got stuff that's in containers on ships that can't get into the port. And so it starts backlogging there. And then you've got China and other manufacturing countries that are shutting everything down. They're not shipping anything. So you can see the problems start occurring in the supply chain. So here it is. We've got a supply chain snafu. We've got final demand is roaring for both non-durable goods and durable goods, but we're not spending on services. Well, what kind of services are you talking about? I'm talking about going to the bars, the restaurants, flying on airplanes, staying in hotels, all of those services that we spent money on that were face-to-face services. Now, all of a sudden, we cut back on those services, but that money that we spent on service that we couldn't spend on services, we go to Amazon.com and we start buying even more unnecessary plastic objects and stuff, and which adds even more to the final demand and adds more to the trucking that needs to be done. So freight rates start increasing, and we start out pre-pandemic 46,000 drivers short of what we need. Fast forward 21 months, we're 80,000 drivers short. Why? You couldn't operate a truck driving school during COVID, right? And much of the merchandise that's shipped today, because of the trucking regulations we have in place, you've got to have team drivers, not just one driver. You got to have 2 drivers. And this driver is vaccinated, this driver is not vaccinated. I'm not writing to that unvaccinated guy or gal, right? So now it's harder to form teams. Tonnage, the freight tonnage that were all the goods that we're shipping has increased. So now we need more containers, we need more trucks, but we don't have drivers to drive them. So you see, this is a perfect storm of many different things happening simultaneously. It's not that person's fault on the other side of the fence. Or I saw on the gas pump the other day, a little sticker. It had a little tiny face of President Biden, and he was pointing up to the price and said, I did this. Come on. That's the rhetoric that you hear. So now you know enough to know the difference, that it's not necessarily who's in office or the political party that's in control. You've got all these forces outside of that that are happening simultaneously. So you had a lot of this final demand was generating. The fortunate thing for our industry is that in spite of the fact that gardening and landscaping, which used to be America's #1 leisure time activity, in spite of the fact that it doesn't even make the top 10 now in terms of leisure time activities, because the Bureau of Labor Statistics keeps track of that with a survey that they conduct every quarter. They keep track of how we spending how much time we're spending working and how much time we're spending gardening, landscaping, reading books, watching television, etc. And so gardening and landscaping is not even in the top 10. But in spite of that, during COVID, folks were staying at home. They're looking outside. My landscape sucks. They're buying more flower shrubs and trees. Remember, growers and everybody else had pulled back on the trigger or on the pedal. So now final demand for flowers, shrubs, and trees goes up. So let's get busy. Let's order more fertilizer. Let's order more pots. Let's order more media. So the demand went up for those inputs. So what happened to those? The inventory levels went way down. So right now, if I'm a grower and I need #3 containers for 3-gallon plants that I want to put in the field, I call up one of the plastic manufacturers, container man, hey, I need 400,000 3-gallon pots. No problem, sir. We'll get that to you in 18 months. Wow. Right? So when you consider the supply chain, if you look at every indicator that looks at how fast products are moving through the supply chain, it's very slow. If you look at the volume of product moving through the supply chain, it's still woefully behind what it was. If you look at the cost of moving products through the supply chain, it's a lot higher than what it was. So here we are in this situation, and we need those inputs, but we can't get them. Is that good or bad? It depends, right? Anytime an economist asks you a question, that's always the answer. It depends. It's not yes or no, it depends, all right? So let's practice this. I'm going to ask you, is that good or bad? That's exactly right, it depends, all right? From the perspective of the grower who'd like to build inventory, that's bad. I can't get the inputs that I need. But I'm sitting over here from an economic point of view. And remember, I grew up in the industry. And since I was a kid, I've seen that every single time in which we've had strong final demand and we've gotten price increases in the industry, we go from shortages to surpluses in really short periods of time. The industry, we're a growing industry. We grow flowers, shrubs, and trees, and we're really good at it. And we can turn a shortage into a surplus really fast. So I'm sitting here thinking, this isn't all bad that growers don't have access to these inputs, because it's delaying this bullwhip effect. This is another economic term. It's a bullwhip effect. Now, all of you have seen Indiana Jones. And you know, when he cracks his whip, that whip goes up. And then when he goes to forward the whip, it goes forward and then down like this. That's exactly the effect of this buildup in inventory, right? It builds up, and then it's got to be like the pig and the python. It's got to move through the supply chain gradually, and then it sorts it back out to normal, right? So the fact that growers can't get enough inputs to build inventory quickly enough is delaying this bullwhip effect, which we're not oversupplying the market. Now, remember I said during COVID, people are wanting flower shrubs and trees. People were buying plants in June, in July, and August, even in Texas. How fun is it to garden and landscaping in June, July, and August in Texas? Not very, but people are still doing it. Why? They want these plants, right? They want these plants because they've heard all about the health and well-being benefits. They've heard about the economic, environmental benefits, but really it's the health and well-being benefits that was driving that. Now, how do I know? It's because I got calls from the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, even Kai Risdahl from Marketplace. I had interviews with all those folks, and they were asking me because they saw all the publications that Melinda and I wrote on the health and well-being benefits. And they said, tell us about this gardening phenomena that we're seeing and why people are gardening so much. And that's when I had this opportunity to tell them about the health and well-being benefits. And so that was a good thing. People are buying plants. So now we're looking at 2021, right? And we're trying to figure out, well, that happened in 2020, that this final demand increased. Is the consumer still going to buy at that same elevated rate in 2021? That was the magic question. And I was telling folks, look, 2020 is an anomaly. I don't think I would base my plans just on 2020. I'd look at the last 3 years, develop an average, and then if I wanted to go 5 or 10% more, I'd go from there. Well, some of them listened and some of them didn't. But the fact of the matter is that the consumer in 2021 did it again. They still bought flowers, shrubs, and trees. They still, although June, July, and August in 2021 was not as good as 2020, right? So they pulled back in those 3 months. But if you look at the retail sales in 2021, the average ticket was up. That is, for each customer, the average amount that each customer bought was up. The traffic count was up. There were more people going through the independent garden centers, Home Depot, Lowe's, Walmart. So the traffic counts were up, and then overall gross sales were up, and net profits were up. So the industry, man, this is a good time to be in the industry. Let's get bigger, right? Let's grow more stuff. Let's sell more stuff. But again, I talked about the constraint on inputs. So that's the great conundrum right now. Now, fast forward to 2022, I'm asking the same question. Could we even remotely in our minds dare to think that the consumer is still going to buy at this elevated rate? I don't know. I do not know. I know that when we ask them in surveys, 62% say they're going to plant more stuff. 28% say they're going to spend more. Now, I don't know how they expected to plant 62% more stuff and only 28% spend more. I don't know where they'll get the other free plants, but that's what the survey said. And then 92% of them said that they were satisfied with how the experience that they had in both 2020 and 2021. And that when they look at their home improvement expenditures, that the majority of them are going to make home improvement expenditures in areas that improve the quality of their lives. Right? And that's where all the information that we've been putting out in terms of how flowers, shrubs, and trees improve the quality of people's lives. They don't just look good, but they're beneficial from an environmental standpoint, and they're beneficial from a psychological standpoint, from a physiological standpoint. When I tried to update an article that I wrote back in 2011, which I summarized all the economic, environmental, and health and well-being benefits in one journal article, Melinda and I started with the health and well-being benefits. It took us 4 journal articles just to summarize the medical research, the psychological research, Betsy, that had been conducted since 2011, just in that 10-year period. 4 journal articles, one only on the physiological benefits, that when we're around flowers, shrubs, and trees, and flowers are in the room, we feel better, we're less stressed, right? There's lower cortisol levels in the body. That we have endopectins, or I forget what the term is, but they're beneficial in terms of type 2 diabetes and in cancer. And our bodies generate chemicals internally that help us combat cancer when we're in the presence of plants. So there's a lot of fascinating physiological benefits, and then psychological and cognitive benefits, where if a kid with ADHD, 20 minutes in the landscape bill that you've designed has the same effect neurologically as 2 of their medications. Yeah, dementia, Alzheimer patients, their memory retention is enhanced. Outburst of aggressive behavior is reduced. All these benefits. And so from an economic standpoint, all this sounds good, but what it's doing is it's influencing the inelasticity of demand. Now, why did I do that? I went to all this feel-good stuff, and now I got to talk about inelasticity of demand. Come on, it's 4:38. You're talking about elasticity of demand. You're killing me, man. So Marco's applauding you. More. What that means is that in an inelastic demand situation, you can raise your price. And even if you sell fewer units, total revenue for the firm still goes up. So what's the obvious question? How do I make my demand more inelastic? Well, I influence the perceived value of my product. And we can do that through marketing. Marketing, the messages that we should be marketing are all about these health and well-being benefits. So if we continue to do those kinds of things and we influence that inelastic demand, prices can still rise. And even if you sell fewer flowers, shrubs, and trees, the firms in the industry are still going to make more money. I do not know if we're knocking on the door of that top inelasticity demand, right? So in other words, does the industry face a conundrum now in terms of pricing? I've been telling them for 34 years now, you got to raise your prices. And now they have. Now I'm looking at the consumer. And Terry, I don't know whether we're going to outprice the consumer's willingness to pay, because those prices are still rising over the last 2 years, while the input costs have risen 14.8%. I calculated an index of prices paid by growers. And over the last 2 years, it's increased by 14.8%. Most growers have raised price by more than that, which meant that the retailer has had to raise prices. So the boomers that are out there, the baby boomers, because of their disposable income, they can afford those higher prices. But what about the 38% of millennials that represent all the houses that are bought now? 38% of those are by millennials. But their incomes right now are a lot lower. The oldest millennial is 43 years of age. They're just now getting into their major income earning years. And so now they're buying a lot of homes. 38%. Can you believe that? 38% of all home purchases are by millennials now. By 2025, they're supposed to be like 70% of the workforce. I mean, they are coming into their own. Now, I don't know whether they can afford those same higher prices. So this is going to be very interesting in terms of this giant experiment, post-COVID experiment of the green industry, and how will the industry respond? How will the consumer respond to these higher prices? And can we still offer not only good, better, best quality, but can we have 3 separate levels of pricing and have everybody purchasing in our industry? That's the big unknown. Those are big questions. Those are ginormous questions that I can't answer that last one. I can tell you what's going to happen in the supply chain. It's going to take all this year for the supply chain, those wrinkles I was talking about, to be ironed out. We're not done yet. It's going to take that long for inflation to start edging down. Although we'll see when the Federal Reserve starts raising interest rates, we're going to see that downward pressure on final demand. And then we'll also see downward pressure on some of those input costs as the supply chain wrinkles get. Will wages go back down? That's an interesting phenomenon. I want to address that, and then I'll open the floor for questions. If you look at wages, historically, horticultural wages, let's see, how would I describe those? The technical term would be they suck, right? You students, are you in horticulture so that you can be millionaires? No, you're in horticulture because you love it, right? However, we're seeing those wage levels increase. Now you can graduate and you can get a good job and you can support yourself and a family with the money that you're making in horticulture. And we're seeing, even during COVID, we're seeing wages increase because we've seen a lot of people not go back to work. The ones that are not back at work, 34% of them are women. 23% of them are people 65 years of age and older who said, you know what, I'm right here at the door of retirement. I'm checking out. I don't need this anymore, right? So 1.5 to 2 million excess retirements during this time period. The other folks that I did mention there, besides the 34% and the 23%, they started their own job. If you look at the historic number of business applications, pre-COVID, it's like 200,000, 200,000, 200,000. It moves up to 250 and so forth, but it's right around that range, right? I'm drawing this air graph right here. During COVID, boom, 600,000 new business applications. So the entrepreneurial spirit, people wanted, they said, I've always wanted to do X, Y, Z. During COVID, maybe they had a loved one pass from COVID, but this is a life-changing experience. And people said, I'm not going to wait any longer. I always wanted to do X, Y, Z. I'm going to try X, Y, Z. And I have a little bit of money in my pocket, so I'm going to start my own business. So we know that's where people have gone. So we've seen wages increase, but if I were to draw you a graph of wages, way back when Ronald Reagan finished his office, his first term, 1984, the employment cost index, which reflects how much businesses have to pay for their employees. This is the graph, 1984, 1990, 1995, 2000, 2010, 2015, a little bit of a started rise very slowly, and then COVID. See a direct increase. But interestingly, as much as wages have gone up here, we are just now where we were in 1984 in terms of those wage levels. right? So the employees as a whole have gone down in terms of their wages. And then it took a pandemic for wages to get up. So when we start talking about $15 minimum wage, that's the base. All right, that's the base. And you hear a lot of political rhetoric. We can't afford $15 an hour. When USDA did their farm labor survey in November, the average field worker in the US across states is making $15.77 an hour. We're already above $15 an hour in agriculture. All right, so don't give me this rhetoric about different states. And in Texas, the minimum wage, $7.25. Half the states in the country are at $7.25. Other states say, you know what? We have to raise wages. We have to give people a livable wage. That's not a term I made up. Livable wage is an actual economic term. And MIT, you can look it up, you can Google this. MIT actually has a livable wage calculator. And you can go to your particular, I think it drills down to zip code. And you can find out what a livable wage would be in your zip code. And so many states, you're already going on there, you can't stand it. I piqued your interest. So many states have said, you know what, we've got to raise wages so people have a livable wage, or we're not going to see prosperity in our state. So that's why we're seeing this wage pressure. And hopefully we'll continue to see that wage approximate livable wages in this country. So I've talked about a whole lot of things. I talked about the supply chain. I've talked about inflation. I have scrapped every single one of my 50 slides, right? I've talked from one slide. So there's got to be questions though. So lay them on me. Terry.
Okay. You did talk about a lot of things, and I really appreciate it. But the one thing, just the last thing you talked about, now I want to go back to something else. Minimum wage. Minimum wage, listen, minimum wage is not a livable wage. It's supposed to be for people entry work. It's not supposed to be the wage that you have when you have a career. And if you raise the minimum wage and you force businesses to raise the minimum wage, then you're going to because they can't afford it.
Okay, let me repeat that for the recording. So yeah, so what I was hearing from Dr. Starman is that if you raise minimum wage, that makes the cost of employing people that much more, and they can't afford to pay the people, and they will go out of business.
And I want to put in that too, that it's young, like people first starting out.
Yeah, first starting out.
That low wage, and they have a chance to build that up. It's not like you've got. I'm not saying that you should make $7 an hour the whole career, but it's okay to have $7 at McDonald's or wherever when you're 16 years old and you're starting out, and that's why we have those lower minimum wages.
Okay, so again, for the recording, is that it's more that was meant for people starting out and so forth, and not necessarily to serve as a livable wage. Now, the counter to that would be that if you look at corporate profits over the last 2 years, they are at an all-time high. So not only have they paid the higher wages, not only have they paid the higher cost of inputs, but because of the price increases that they've received, corporate profits have never been higher. So there is a means of paying a higher minimum wage. And when the top 1% of income earners in this country, the billionaires in the country, they gained over $1.5 trillion in wealth. So this is the wealth inequality issue, and that's a lot bigger discussion than what we have right now.
Yeah, because I'm talking about people like the mom, wages that they can. Is that, now, I don't know about the corporation.
Well, let's just tie it to the green industry, right? Let's tie it to the green industry. In my Your Market Metrics database, in which I collect income statement balance sheet data, over the last 2 years, net profit has increased 530% among the 63 growers in my database. So there's the means in which to pay those higher prices. Did you say something, Marco?
More than the minimum wage already.
Yeah, that was my, in fact, Amazon is paying $19 and $10 an hour.
Another thing is like, when I first started teaching, I was making $13,000 a year, and I know it's completely 40 years ago. But, you know, it's like, I kind of think that everybody these days, because of the internet and everything, thinks that they should have what all the movie stars have right out of the gate, you know? And we need to, people need to learn to live more minimally, I think, and then it's the American dream to build that up. You don't just, you know, too much is being given to people, in my opinion, to do.
Okay, but I'm not hearing data in there. I'm hearing
I guess-
opinion. So,
Well,
okay, Marco?
I want to follow up on that. This is quite interesting. You mentioned there's a high increase in wages, right? And you asked the question, are wages going to come down? You also mentioned this concept of, expenditures rise to meet income. And so I'm a little bit worried about what will happen if wages do come down. What's going to happen to those people who are used to that level? And if wages come down, what's going to happen with work ethic? What's going to happen with people maybe potentially quitting? That might be a potential shock to the labor market that we might anticipate if those wages come down. Which is kind of related. People get used to that level. And if that comes down, are they just going to seek other jobs, or they're going to be unemployed? I think I don't know that we know the answer for that, but it's an interesting.
So I've been referring to that as the great catch-up, Terry, that, remember the employment cost index that went down and so forth, and now it's back up? Well, this is where this is the time period when corporate profits are where they are, that industries can afford to catch up to where they were back in 1984, because the purchasing power of those families has declined for 3 decades or more. Okay, Mike?
I would just make a comment relative to if it's going to put a business out of business to go to minimum wage, should they be in business in the first place? Yeah, if you can't compete and pay the going wage, should you be in business?
Right. So Mike's comment, just for the recording, was that if you can't afford to pay a minimum wage, should you have been in business in the first place? Yeah. Okay.
It says for
Charlie?
property wage is $10 an hour. I'm looking at your MIT.
Yeah.
calculator.
Property wages in Brazos County, $10 an hour.
Well, if you have 2 children, I'm basing it on myself. And a person in my situation with 2 kids needs to make $34 an hour. in
At
order to-
that
to
livable
have a
wage.
living wage,
Right.
According to the MIT calculator.
We
Right.
also have this up here for 0 children and 1 adult. For me, it would be, living wage would be $13.36 an hour. So I was trying to do the math on what I'm getting paid as a grad student.
Well, you're only paid for a certain amount of hours, 20 hours a week, right? So you gotta make that conversion there. Because full-time wage, 40 hours a week, that's 2,080 hours in a year. So divide that by 1,040. All right, then you can come out with it. The fact of the matter is, if you consider all the hours that you truly work. Okay, what's our timeline?
Charlie, I
Yeah,
have a question.
One more question.
Charlie,
Yeah.
do you have any idea about how many of the nurseries and greenhouse operations are using the profits that you're making now to reinvest in facilities upgrades and robotics and automation and other technologies that they'll need in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dr. Lineberger, and I do, because I just surveyed those before my meeting with my Eagle group in Dallas. And I tell folks, you got 3 buckets in which to put these excess profits in. Number 1, you can pay down long-term debt or pay out dividends. Number 2, you can invest in CapEx, which is capital expenditures, all the things Dr. Lineberger is talking about. Or number 3, you can build tradable assets. That is, build inventory, right? 40% of those that I surveyed, Dr. Lineberger, are building inventory, right? And another 20% are paying down long-term debt. And then the rest of the folks are primarily spending on CapEx. So between the CapEx and the building inventory, you see the handwriting on the wall in terms of what's coming in that bullwhip effect I was talking about earlier.
Right.
So we got one major greenhouse that just put in another 1 million square feet of greenhouse space. We got 3 growers on the nursery side that put in over 40 acres of gravel and irrigation. So they're going to ramp up the demand side, the supply side. Yes, Betsy.
My family, and they say people are investing in the large farm implements now, like, they can't even keep them in stock. Now is the time that people are reinvesting in their business.
Yeah. And that's part of what we see when there's excess profits. We'll see those decisions between those 3 buckets. And I'm just telling people, choose wisely, because this type of time period, there is another part of the business cycle that will come around, and you don't want to be over leveraged when the cycle turns. And that's why we saw so many businesses go out of business during the Great Recession, is because they were over leveraged. Wasn't that they weren't growing good quality plants, but the bank had more skin in the game than they did. And that's when the bank starts calling the note and you can't have the cash to pay it. That's why Carolina Nurseries and other top nurseries in the country went out of business. So, all right. I think we're 30 seconds away, but thank you very much for being here and the invitation.